The critical difference between libertarians and other people is their view of the role of the state, the government. Libertarians regard the state as the supreme, the eternal, the best organized aggressor against the persons and property of the mass of the public. All states, everywhere, whether democratic, dictatorial, or monarchical, whether red, white, blue, or brown. The state. Always and ever, the government and its rulers and operators have been considered above the general moral law. Service to the state is supposed to excuse all actions that would be considered immoral or criminal if committed by private citizens. The distinctive feature of libertarians is that they coolly and uncompromisingly apply the general moral law to people acting in their roles as members of the state apparatus. Libertarians make no exceptions. For centuries, the state, or more strictly, individuals acting in their roles as members of the government, has cloaked its criminal activity in high-sounding rhetoric. For centuries, the state has committed mass murder and called it war, then ennobled the mass slaughter that war involves. For centuries, the state has enslaved people into its armed battalions and called it conscription in the national service. For centuries, the state has robbed people at bayonet point and called it taxation. In fact, if you wish to know how libertarians regard the state and any of its acts, simply think of the state as a criminal band, and all of the libertarian attitudes will logically fall into place. Let us consider, for example, what it is that sharply distinguishes government from all other organizations in society. Many political scientists and sociologists have blurred this vital distinction and refer to all organizations and groups as hierarchical, structured, governmental, etc. Left-wing anarchists, for example, will oppose equally government and private organizations, such as corporations, on the ground that each is equally elitist and coercive. But the rightist libertarian is not opposed to inequality, and his concept of coercion applies only to the use of violence. The libertarian sees a crucial distinction between government, whether central, state, or local, and all other institutions in society. Or rather, two crucial distinctions. First, every other person or group receives its income by voluntary payment, either by voluntary contribution or gift, such as the local community chest or bridge club, or by voluntary purchase of its goods or services on the market. For example, grocery store owner, baseball player, steel manufacturer, etc. Only the government obtains its income by coercion and violence, that is, by the direct threat of confiscation or imprisonment if payment is not forthcoming. This coerced levy is taxation. A second distinction is that, apart from criminal outlaws, only the government can use its funds to commit violence against its own or any other subjects. Only the government can prohibit pornography, compel a religious observance, or put people in jail for selling goods at a higher price than the government deems fit. Both distinctions, of course, can be summed up as only the government in society is empowered to aggress against the property rights of its subjects, whether to extract revenue, to impose its moral code, or to kill those with whom it disagrees. Furthermore, any and all governments, even the least despotic, have always obtained the bulk of their income from the coercive taxing power. And historically, by far the overwhelming portion of all enslavement and murder in the history of the world have come from the hands of government. And since we have seen that the central thrust of the libertarian is to oppose all aggression against the rights of person and property, the libertarian necessarily opposes the institution of the state as the inherent and overwhelmingly the most important enemy of those precious rights. There is another reason why state aggression has been far more important than private, a reason apart from the greater organization and central mobilizing of resources that the rulers of the state can impose. The reason is the absence of any check upon state depredation, a check that does exist when we have to worry about muggers or the mafia. To guard against private criminals, we have been able to turn to the state and its police. But who can guard us against the state itself? No one. For another critical distinction of the state is that it compels the monopolization of the service of protection. The state arrogates to itself a virtual monopoly of violence and of ultimate decision-making in society. If we don't like the decisions of the state courts, for example, there are no other agencies of protection to which we may turn. It is true that in the United States, at least, we have a constitution that imposes strict limits on some powers of government. But, as we have discovered in the past century, no constitution can interpret or enforce itself. It must be interpreted by men. And if the ultimate power to interpret a constitution is given to the government's own Supreme Court, then the inevitable tendency is for the court to continue to place its imprimatur on ever broader powers for its own government. Furthermore, the highly touted checks and balances and separation of powers in the American government are flimsy indeed, since in the final analysis all of these divisions are part of the same government and are governed by the same set of rulers. One of America's most brilliant political theorists, John C. Calhoun, wrote prophetically of the inherent tendency of a state to break through the limits of its written constitution. A written constitution certainly has many and considerable advantages, but it is a great mistake to suppose that the mere insertion of provisions to restrict and limit the powers of the government, without investing those for whose protection they are inserted with the means of enforcing their observance, will be sufficient to prevent the major and dominant party from abusing its powers. Being the party in possession of the government, they will be in favor of the powers granted by the Constitution and opposed to the restrictions intended to limit them. As the major and dominant parties, they will have no need of these restrictions for their protection. The minor or weaker party, on the contrary, would take the opposite direction and regard them as essential to their protection against the dominant party. But where there are no means by which they could compel the major party to observe the restrictions, the only resort left them would be a strict construction of the Constitution. To this, the major party would oppose a liberal construction, one which would give to the words of the grant the broadest meaning of which they were susceptible. It would then be construction against construction, the one to construct and the other to enlarge the powers of the government to the utmost. But of what possible avail could the strict construction of the minor party be against the liberal interpretation of the major, when the one would have all the powers of the government to carry its construction into effect, and the other be deprived of all means of enforcing its construction? In a contest so unequal, the result would not be doubtful. The party in favor of the restrictions would be overpowered. The end of the contest would be the subversion of the Constitution. The restrictions would ultimately be annulled, and the government be converted into one of unlimited powers.